So we're ready. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining our press conference regarding the 32nd public board meeting. We have around 30 minutes or so for questions. Remember that you may submit questions through the chat box or use the raise hand button to make a question. So we're going to start. I see Osman. You can go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much. Greetings to you all. My questions is regarding some comments some of the board members made just a few minutes ago related to this desire to use some, I don't know if this is the right wording, but this is somehow giving control back to leaders in Puerto Rico, giving the reins back or so they have control again. How, if some of you can elaborate a little bit about that, how would that happen? Is you're thinking like the board working just in the background or amending promesa? What exactly is your thought? What would you want to, what do you want to see happen? If you can elaborate, please.
I can take that question because I made the comment. This is Justin Peterson. Promesa is clear. The statute says that the board can go away after 4 years of balanced budgets following a successful plan of restructuring. And so, I'm not speaking for the rest of my colleagues. As I said during the meeting, I was speaking directly to Puerto Rico's leaders and to the United States Congress in advocating that we use this inflection point as an opportunity to talk about the role of the board. Promesa, when it was passed, had two primary designs. One was to restructure the debt, and the other was to facilitate reforms. But for almost 5 years, Promesa and the board was used as a shield against creditors. For 4 years it was. The last year and a half, I think we righted the ship and we got a deal done. But in the meantime, very little in the way of structural reforms have occurred. And I think that points to the limitations of the board's actual statutory authority, not by any means the hard work performed by the board staff and the advisors, et cetera. That's, not in question. But at the end of the day, this is America. 3.5 million people living in Puerto Rico are American citizens. And Promesa was passed under the Territories Clause of the U.S. Constitution. And Americans shouldn't be governed in perpetuity by a board of 7 people. Now, it's not up to us to decide when the board goes away. And I am definitely not speaking for the entire board. I'm speaking as an individual and hoping that Congress, including some of the members of Congress like Nydia Velázquez, who was a champion of Promesa, that they will look at this and revisit it and decide that it's time to give Puerto Rico's leaders the con, and it's time to restore sovereignty to Puerto Rico. And this is a great time to look at it because we just finished ending bankruptcy. And so that's why I said what I said. And again, it's not up to the board, it's up to Congress, but I'm a resource to do whatever I can to advocate that that Congress amend Promesa and begin to wind down the term of the board, because ultimately we have to get buy-in. We can't just be here forever. Governor Pierluisi is the rightfully elected governor of Puerto Rico, and Speaker Hernandez is the speaker. President Dalmau is the leader of the Senate. These are the individuals that have been voted for at the ballot box, not us. So that's why I said what I said. And again, I'm speaking for myself, not for the board members. And it's not up to the board when we leave, it's up to Congress. So that's who I was speaking to. Thank you for your question.
I think Andrew and John, wanted to just speak to the question as well.
Sure. Just if I could, to provide a bit of context on what my colleague Justin Peterson just said. And, a person would be a fool not to be troubled by having a board of people who are mostly not from the island, unelected, appointed by the president, having such significant influence on what goes on in Puerto Rico. So it is the idea of returning the more control of what happens in Puerto Rico to the leaders who are elected by Puerto Ricans is obvious. It's and that's ultimately where we want to go, where we need to go. At the same time, though, you don't end up with an oversight board like the one we have in Puerto Rico unless some very, very serious errors have been made along the way. And those errors have impacted the quality of life and the economic prosperity of Puerto Ricans in almost every area, whether it's education, whether it's the labor market. There are serious problems that need to be addressed here. And if I thought they would be fully addressed and completely addressed without the board being there, I would say dissolve the board today. But I really don't have confidence that those serious issues dealing with the right of Puerto Ricans to have a decent life, if they're not going to be addressed by the government, I believe that it's important that the board do so. Just as a couple of examples, the idea of ensuring that all teachers actually show up to work, the time and attendance that Ms. Juresco talked about, that is something that simply would not have happened if the board had not insisted on it. Similarly, if we go back another 6 months or a year, we had problems in the education department. We may have them throughout the government. I'm not focusing on the education system. We had problems where people who are no longer working for the government were being paid. These were people who'd gone on to different jobs or retired. They're continuing to be paid because nobody had bothered to get the systems right to do so. That is a serious problem. And again, that would not have been addressed unless the board did it. So the issue comes down to how important are the remaining issues to the prosperity of Puerto Ricans, and I think they're extremely important, and what is the probability they are going to get addressed if the board does not push the point? And I think the probability is very low. So, I wish we could be dissolved today, but I think there is too much on the line, too much at stake for the people of Puerto Rico for us to give up now. Thanks.
Thanks, Andrew. John?
Yes, I appreciate that. And I agree with Andrew's comments, and respectfully, Justin Peterson's a great colleague of mine, and I appreciate his comments as well. I too would love to see the board be dissolved. One of the reasons I joined this board, though, was not to just take care of the restructuring. I mean, the restructuring, while it was a Herculean task, it's not the end of the game. And clearly what I'm focused about, again, I've got 25 plus years in government, dealing with governance within government, understand best financial practices. I understand things that I can see that will make government stronger for the people. Again, government exists there for the people, to take care of the people of Puerto Rico. And just as I've been on the board over the last year, I'll be honest with you, some of the legislation that I've seen that the board's commented and had to block is troubling and leads me to believe that there's a lot of work that still needs to be done as far as spending controls and fiscal responsibility there on the island. And I'm concerned right now we have a situation where there's a lot of money flowing to the island. I mean, you've got billions of federal dollars coming to the island. The economy is doing really well. It's all as well. What do we need to worry about? My concern is that money is going to just be spent. And what we really need to do is make sure that we're working with the elected officials to make sure that it's just not spent, but that we're making investments, strategic investments, that's going to set up Puerto Rico to really prosper into the future. Really, our work will be determined whether we were successful or not in the next 5 or 10 years. Is Puerto Rico going to be back in bankruptcy? I think absent these fiscal reforms and fiscal controls that Governor Perry Luisi said that he was willing to work with us on and get implemented, I think absent those, Puerto Rico is going to be right back in bankruptcy. And the problem with that is all the pensioners in Puerto Rico, I mean, their pensions are secure now, but if Puerto Rico takes a nosedive right back into bankruptcy, they're going to be fighting for their pensions again in 5 or 10 years. I mean, you know, the deal is set and the deal is structured right now to be successful. But as part of that deal it does include a lot of fiscal reforms. And really, it's not for us in the board. I mean, I'll move on off the board. And again, I don't think we should be a perpetual board. I think we should dissolve as quickly as we can. But there are some real things that need to happen, some real changes that the governor needs to step up and the legislative leaders need to step up and ensure that they're happening. And if they're happening, then I absolutely will advocate the board terminate. But absent that, I think we need to work together hand in hand to make sure that those things happen. So while I totally agree that Puerto Rico should not be governed by an appointed board, absolutely 100% agree with that. There's a lot that needs to happen and we can do it quickly, but there's a lot that needs to happen before our work is done.
Thanks, John. And Antonio, I think, would like to say something.
Yes, hello, everybody. The first thing I'll say is, as a Puerto Rican and a resident of Puerto Rico, I think all Puerto Ricans want the board to finish as quickly as possible, and I agree with that statement. However, the PROMESA legislation provides very specific conditions for the board to terminate its operation. First, coming out of bankruptcy, which right now we're celebrating this historic moment, but we also need to have 4 years of balanced budgets, and we need to return to the markets at reasonable prices. That will take some time, going back to the markets. And as my colleagues have mentioned, and I believe a lot of Puerto Ricans have been frustrated for many years, we need to make sure as Puerto Ricans that we have a government that works for the people, that utilizes its resources in the best possible ways, and that has the best possible systems and processes. The fiscal plan includes a significant amount of structural reforms that I believe that now that the main focus of ending the bankruptcy of the Commonwealth should be first and foremost for the board. That said, we do still have PREPA, which, as you know, is probably one of the more complex agencies that we still need to restructure, as well as the Highway and Transit Authority. Therefore, while I agree with Justin that we must look at terminating the board as efficiently as quickly as possible, there are still some big ticket items that we need to pursue together with the administration. I think that the one very significant step that we've made over the last year is that the amount of collaboration between the board and the elected officials has significantly increased. Now that we're coming out of bankruptcy, my personal opinion is that the board really needs to look at economic development and restoring economic growth as the most important objective. We need to return to PROMESA, look at Title V, look at the list of the strategic projects and the permits in order for the board to conclude its operations, but really leave Puerto Rico in the most optimal conditions that are possible. Thank you.
Thanks, Antonio. And I'll just say that I fully share Andrew's, John's, and Antonio's views on these issues.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Next question, Alex Fernandez, Cyber News.
Hi. I have a question. The governor said that he does not agree at all, fully agree with the plan, but he's willing to get forward with the plan and looking forward to make some adjustments, like the increased salary of the public employees and some of the administrative regulations. Is that something that the board might be flexible about, or there is no room for changes in that area? And also about the administrative things that you think that Puerto Rico needs to do for not going back to bankruptcy. does that something that you expect to be approved by the legislature and be by law, or do you think is only with the compromise of the government to do it will be necessary? Thank you.
Go ahead, Natalie.
So Alex, you know, I'm not certain what specific items the governor disagrees with. He mentioned that he thinks teachers should receive higher increases in pay. That's not possible simply because of all the other things that are happening, the monies that are being invested in the pension trust and the other salary increases that are being provided to the other members of the civil service. And so that's just a mathematical answer. We have to maintain a balanced budget. And at this time, there aren't incremental assets or resources to provide. That doesn't mean that in the future, if the economy grows above and beyond the projections in the fiscal plan, or if legislation changes in Washington providing, you know, incremental stimulus or incremental funds, that the situation can't be reviewed in the future if incremental resources are available. But for now, on that point, there aren't incremental resources available beyond what's in the fiscal plan. So I can't speak to which other items the governor disagrees with and what they would mean. The plan has been certified. The next step will be certifying a budget, and the budget will then need to be lived within, like all budgets. In terms of your second question, I think what I would urge you to do is look at this section of the fiscal plan on the financial management agenda. Those are really the elements that we believe need to kind of be in place in order to establish strong financial management and avoid return to bankruptcy, whether that's cash management or debt policy management. And each one has a different set of requirements. And so you ask whether it requires legislation. A strong, broad office of the CFO would benefit from legislation. You don't have to have it. You can operate on the basis of what we have today, but it would be preferable to broaden it and strengthen it further. On time and attendance, you don't need legislation. On cash management policies, you don't need legislation. On debt policy management, the previous legislature already adopted legislation. So now it's just an administrative. So it really is element by element, and I can't give you a broad answer. But if you look at that financial management agenda, which includes, you know, foundational elements like the Office of the CFO, and then specific tasks, including, as I said, cash management, debt policy management, each one of them has an outline of milestones and the next steps.
Thank you. Mari Carmen Rivera, El Vocero. Next question.
Yes, hi, thank you. I have two questions. It's just that Promesa includes an exit plan regarding the ability of the island to have balanced budgets and access to the market. But some members are talking about other requirements that they want to see met before we can see the board go. So my question is, who decides when the board leaves, and where is that exit plan? And I have another question.
I don't think board members were suggesting adding things, but they were suggesting that to meet the requirements in the law, things had to happen. So for example, if you take what the law says about 4 balanced budgets on a modified accrual accounting basis, that's in the law, right? To have 4 consecutive years of the territorial government having 4 consecutive years of balanced budgets, you have to manage your cash. You have to manage your budget. You have to adopt modified accrual accounting statements. For the board to certify that a budget was in fact balanced, you have to have the audited financial statements ready and able to use as a comparison. So putting in place the financial management that allows you to have timely audited financial audited statements is part of that. I won't speak on behalf of the board members, but I think, you know, to balance the budget, you need to earn the revenues. You need to limit your expenditures to the revenues you earn, and you need to be able to, according to the law, balance that, and the board has to be able to certify that for consecutive years. I see John has his hand up.
So when is exactly that the board will leave? Like, what is that time frame? Where is that exit plan?
That's up to Congress. Congress decides. It's written in the statute One reason, I don't know who I'm speaking with, but this is Justin Peterson. One reason why I am very interested and I'm an advocate for Congress revisiting and reopening PROMESA is because I think only Congress can decide when the board goes away. And given that we're ending bankruptcy, now is a good time for a conversation. If not, then we're in this situation where it's just up to the board to decide whether or not Puerto Rico has met the metrics. And depending on who is here, that can be too subjective. And so Congress should revisit PROMESA. It's not up to the board to decide how long the board is here. Congress just makes that decision. I'm in favor of Congress looking into it again. Nydia Velázquez, who was a champion of PROMESA, who did everything she could to ensure that PROMESA was passed. She and other members of Congress, Nancy Pelosi, Paul Ryan, who's no longer there, they should look at where we're at in the process and ask themselves, do we want the board to be here another 5 years, another whatever it's going to be? Was the board going to be here for a decade or more? Everything that John and Andrew said is correct, that we should be working on reforms. But I agree with that. I just think that Puerto Rico's own elected officials should be leading that, because this is America. We don't have boards or Politburos. We have elected representatives. So Congress is the one body who can look into this.
Let me just add a few things. Justin, I totally agree with you. This is America, but when you get into $120 billion worth of debt and bankrupt and dissolve the debt of billions of dollars with creditors, I think you put yourself in a situation where there's some oversight that does need to take place. And so I totally agree. And let me just clarify my comments, because you're probably referring to mine. I'm not adding new provisions. What I'm saying is, for me as a board member, I would love to see the board terminated. But before I advocate for an early exit from what's already in PROMESA of the 4 years of balanced budgets, I would need to see that some of the fiscal reforms that are in the fiscal plan are being implemented and being acted upon. And I haven't seen that. They have done some work, but there's a lot left to be done. So I'm not suggesting that we add new provisions. I think PROMESA was thought through. I think that it's not uncommon to have a tell to make sure that the fiscal plan sticks. I mean, if we were to leave tomorrow and they were going to fall right back to where they were going, and with the fiscal responsibility that they've had over the last several decades, we will have totally missed our work, and the future debt payments that we've just now agreed to would come into question. Retirees' pensions will come back into question. There has to be fiscal sustainability. So while I'm not suggesting we add all of the new fiscal sustainability language, what I'm saying is, for me as a board member to advocate for an early exit of the board, like pre the 4 years, I would need to see some action and some movement on these fiscal reforms, pretty much quite a bit of action and quite a bit of movement. So I hope that clarifies. I'm not suggesting we add new provisions, but I'm not willing to advocate an early exit until I actually see some meaningful progress along with reforms that are in the fiscal plan.
Thank you, John. Antonio?
Yes, I'm somewhat aligned with what's been said, but I want to make it clear we're not creating any additional conditions. From my point of view, any potential future changes to the legislation are speculative in nature, because we don't know the future. If they come, we'll work with them. That said, we do have to work with the legislation as it stands today. And the legislation is actually fairly straightforward. It talks about 4 balanced budgets. I fully support Natalie's comments. If you might recall, we don't even have financial statements from 2019. So we do have to work very closely with the government to change the process such that we can get timely financial statements. Getting those financial statements and getting balanced budgets will help us get to the market at a reasonable cost. Therefore, it's all connected. I think at this point, from my point of view, rather than speculate of what could change and what changes Congress could enact, and they could, I think we need to stick to the letter of the law. And work together in a collaborative manner with the elected officials and ensure that Puerto Rico gets the best possible outcome of the tenure of the board, whether that's 4 years from now or less or more, depending on whatever happens in the future. We are here to serve the people of Puerto Rico and to drive the best possible outcome for the Commonwealth. And that's what I believe, that as we end bankruptcy for the Commonwealth, our efforts need to be moving towards economic development and an efficient government operation.
I'd just like to reiterate one of the things that Antonio said, and just to make sure there's no confusion, and that is the law is very clear about how long the board stays in place. It's one of the clearest parts of PROMESA. There are two basic requirements. Puerto Rico has to have access to the capital markets at reasonable short-term and long-term interest rates. That's the first requirement. Second requirement is 4 consecutive balanced budgets according to modified accrual counting. So it's very, very clear. One of the really exciting things to me about both the restructuring and the fiscal plan that we certified today is they make it possible that this fiscal year could be the first balanced budget that Puerto Rico has had. Puerto Rico will now be paying debt service. It will be paying all of its expenses, not holding up on them. And this could be the first of those 4 years. So I think it's something to celebrate, but celebrate knowing that the law is very clear what the requirements are.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Next question is Michelle Kaske from Bloomberg.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for taking my questions, and congratulations on certifying the most recent fiscal plan. So I have 2 questions. The first is, when I compare the GNP projections in this updated plan with last year's certified fiscal plan, it looks like, I mean, yes, the first couple of years, this year and next fiscal year, the GNP growth is projected to be higher than what you were projecting for the same time period in the last certified fiscal plan. But in years after that, it's actually lower. So am I looking at the wrong thing? Or, can you explain to me why actually does it look like economic growth won't be in the outer years, won't be as strong as you were anticipating last year? And then my second question has to do with new borrowing.
So yes, Michelle, you're correct that the early COVID stimulus related effect is greater than what we had in our previous fiscal plan, partly as a result of incremental federal stimulus that was adopted after the last fiscal plan. So growth is projected to be higher in 22, 23. And then you're correct, as spending tapers off, it returns back to its historic negative trend. And it is, settles in at that same trend around, between 0 and 1% in that range. The fact that it's slightly worse is off a higher base. So I think that's a part of why you see that the numbers shifting slightly negative. There's no other real, serious reason for that being slightly more negative, other than that you're off of a higher base, given the higher growth in the early years.
And also a follow-up to that is the GNP projections as of now. Do they anticipate the government implementing the structural reforms that haven't been fully implemented yet, or does it not include those assumptions?
It does include a series of structural reforms and the assumption that they will be implemented on the schedule in the plan. It excludes others. So you need to look at the structural reforms section, and it'll show you exactly which reform, what's expected, and what the expected GNP contribution is of each one of them over a period of
that's right. Years. I remember that now. And then my last question was about borrowing. Does this fiscal plan incorporate any anticipated new general obligation borrowing?
It does not.
Okay.
It does assume that there is space within the debt management policy, because as you saw, the actual percentage of the plan of adjustment, Commonwealth plan of adjustment and COFINA debt, it becomes a smaller percentage of debt policy revenues over time. So you would theoretically have space within that limit to borrow in the future, but we don't include it because we don't know whether they will have access to markets and we don't know whether they'll need the debt. You know, right now the government is very focused on investing the federal funds that it has into infrastructure. It wouldn't have an urgent need to borrow at this point.
Well, do you have an estimate of what's the size of that capacity if the government did have market access and did see the need for new geo borrowing? What's the amount that they could do?
Off the top of my head, I can't tell you the amount, but again, if you look at that second slide that we showed,
okay,
in fiscal year 45 and 48, you're at 4.5 or 5.5% of revenues, and you can borrow up to almost 8%. So that 3% is your space. And again, all of this is based on projections that are pretty far out there. So a lot of it's going to depend on revenues and the growth of the economy. If the growth of the economy is faster, then there would be more space.
Okay, thank you.
Sylvette, there are questions in the chat box.
Yes.
I don't know if you want to go to the questions in the chat box or you want to.
Yes, one is from Eva. Eva, I don't know if you want to make the question or you want me to read it. So I'm going to read it. Does the board think the government is not ready or capable of implementing the debt adjustment plan? Who will make sure the fiscal plan and the debt adjustment plan are implemented once the board leaves?
Well, go ahead, Natalie, if you want to.
Well, I think a lot of the conversation today has been about that. I mean, one is we've done all we can to put in place a plan that is feasible, sustainable, but it requires actions on the part of the government, right? If you talk about implementing the plan in the very short term, meaning getting to the effective date on March 15th, you heard the governor fully committed, the government is fully committed to making this plan effective and doing everything necessary on March 15th for the exchange of bonds, the putting the money into the defined contribution accounts for Sistema 2000, providing social security to teachers and judges, all of that. If you want to look at the narrow definition of implementing the plan of adjustment, the government is very committed to get done on that effective date, and I don't foresee any major challenges. If you're thinking more broadly about kind of achieving the targets that are in the plan, achieving revenue targets, staying within a balanced budget, all of that requires the kind of financial management agenda that we talked about. The board members have talked about that we focus on in the plan, making sure that debt policy management when the board is gone is managed in a responsible fashion by the office of the CFO, by the government itself, that the legislature implements a legislative congressional budget office, a legislative budget office, nonpartisan, to score legislation, to avoid adopting legislation that it can't afford, which is something that happens often. Has in the past and continues. So all of those things are not yet in place that would, in kind of medium to long term, assure the people of Puerto Rico that the plan will, over time, be fully implemented. If you're thinking about the economics of it, but that's all of the things that we are working with the government to ensure can be implemented when the board is gone.
Okay, thank you. I have another question from Jose. It's concerning the status of negotiations involving Act 80, 81, and 82. AFAF says that the Oversight Board has rejected proposals put forth by the government Pierluisi administration.
I don't think that that's 100% accurate. On Law 81, for example, we announced today something that we have been talking to the government about for quite some time with regard to the Act 1 and Act 447 police enhanced retirement benefits. We've reached agreement with the government and we've worked with the police. You've seen it in the press. We met with them yesterday. And so, I think on Law 81, I think we've reached an agreement. With regard to Law 80 and 82, the ball's kind of in the court of the government. They would have to come to us with a proposal and we would, work on it, not dissimilarly than we did to their proposal on Law 81. But time is moving.
Thank you, Natalie. Next question will be Oscar Serrano from Noticel.
Yes, hi, thank you for that. I have a couple of questions. The plan, the projections rely a lot on the influx of federal money for reconstruction. But I have a concern with that reliance, and is that the fact that we are seeing with many of these contracts that have been given out by the government is that they're given out to mainland companies that may charge, for example, $300 for a project management position or whatever, and pay the actual person, the actual local person doing the work, probably 100, and there's 200 left that just go as a profit to the company or so for some other purpose, but not exactly stay in the local economy. So I'm wondering if you know about that, if you have taken that into account, and if there are things you can do to make sure that the money that comes in stays as much as it can in the local economy.
So 2 questions. One, yes, if you look at the section of the fiscal plan that talks about how we project the federal disaster funds, there are different multiplier effects used for each one of them based on what we acknowledged from the beginning would be some of the money going into infrastructure, some going into the local economy, and some going, as you say, to contractors or work that leaves the economy. So for each different kind of category, it's calculated based on the contracts that we've seen in the past and the experience of Puerto Rico over the past few years in these contracts. So that we did take into account, yes. In terms of your second question, is there anything that can be done? That really is not something that we have any influence and or authority over. That is something that happens through Core 3, PREPA, the different contractors, and it really has a great deal to do with what skill sets are available on the island. Kind of even more than the management of the contracting process, it's about getting skill sets on the island up such that there's sufficient skilled workers to actually do all the contracts. So that's something that we don't have a direct influence and or ability to change.
And if I may quickly, reforms that are pending seem to be at the center of internal discussions in the board about how to move forward with the board. So I don't want to repeat all that, but I do want to ask if you can be as precise as you can, what kind of sticks and carrots do you have available to actually move forward the reforms that the fiscal plan acknowledges have been, and you yourselves this morning, have been slow in coming about?
Yeah, the law provides us primarily budgetary sticks and carrots. And so when we have the ability to use that budgetary process to provide carrots, we do. And it doesn't always work. It's a very blunt tool to use. So for example, you want to see K through 12 education improve. You want to see the educational outcomes. In other words, the actual education that these children are receiving, you want it to improve. How do we get there? Well, it starts very basic. You want the teachers to be in school, part of the time in attendance. Then you want the students to be in school, which again is taking attendance of the students, having that information to be able to determine, which students are not coming in regularly, to be able to talk. If you look at the fiscal plan, we're working with the Department of Education on each of these elements of what could help to produce a better educational outcome. And some of them require resources, budgetary resources. And so we provide them to the Department of Education to enable them to get there. Paying teachers better is part of getting a better educational outcome. So I think, the budget is the primary tool. I think a secondary issue is that, you have to meet your revenue targets to spend the money that you want to spend, right? I think one of the board members said this earlier. The more you earn, the more you can invest into salaries. The more you earn, the more you can invest into infrastructure, roads, whatever public services demand and require. So, one of the greatest carrots for any government on those structural reforms is the fact that those structural reforms will deliver growth. Growth delivers revenues, and then that gives you the ability to turn that into investment into the people. And so the primary incentive is not the board, but just the desire to make this island more prosperous, and a better place for everyone to live.
Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie. Next question, Joanisabel, nuevo día.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I have a couple of questions. The first is that it's my impression that there's a lot on the plate, and I would like to get a sense from you. Is it feasible to proceed with the PREPA restructuring and the Highway Authority restructuring this very year, while at the same time we are pushing for all these changes through the fiscal plan?
It's absolutely possible. I think we need to make sure we understand PREPA and HTA are two different instrumentalities with different boards, with different management teams. What we talked about today was solely the Commonwealth, the central government. And, PREPA and HTA, have certainly the capacity to do this. And we as a board have a responsibility. I think it was Justin who said, this is the year to take everybody out of bankruptcy. And it is our mandate. And so, that is the goal, and it is doable. We need everyone's collaboration and cooperation. It's obviously easier with cooperation, but it's doable.
The reason I'm asking for this is because all of these new changes for all these new agenda also clashes with another reality. The fact that a Speaker of the House has said this a couple of weeks ago. Legislature fears that once we pass this July, the sense or the urgency within the legislature to pass any kind of important measures related to fiscal governance, that will be a challenge. Passing PREPA's restructuring bill would be a challenge. So I'm trying to be realistic here. Because it seems to me that although we can activate the clock regarding the Commonwealth and the target of four balanced budgets, the truth is that there's still this other things that needs to be accomplished. So how likely is that we're going to get the legislature that will be needed?
Let's just simplify to say that with PREPA, we look forward to getting that legislative answer in this first half of this calendar year. And with HTA, we don't see that any legislation is necessary.
The other question has to do with the projections within the plan within this new fiscal plan. Basically,
Johnny, I see Justin has his hand up. I don't know whether that.
Oh.
And I see Antonio as well. Maybe it's to the last question, previous question, before you go further.
My hand. Yes, thank you. Thank you, Natalie. Everything Natalie said is right. I just want to clarify that if the legislature doesn't act on PREPA, we still will. And we can get that done this year, and we're going to get it done this year. The bondholders of PREPA haven't been paid anything for 7 years. It's an outrage. In my view, I've said this, that the RSA doesn't even do justice to them given that. But we don't need the legislature, in fact, to get PREPA done. And so I just want to make sure everybody here on this call understands that. And we're going to get it done.
Well, not only just a brief comment to the last question. I think that the biggest common objective that we all have is to end the board as quickly and efficiently as possible. I do believe that all the elected officials would agree with that statement. And the last year demonstrates to me a willingness to collaborate. In the past, it was much harder to get things done and to get to agreements between the House, the Senate, the governor, or the administration and the board. But now we do have a year of several important agreements success. I do believe that while the political calendar is going to be what the political calendar is, and we're going to be whatever date in the 4-year terms that we're at, the board does not necessarily follow that calendar in terms of what we can and cannot achieve. And we're committed to achieve the objectives that are laid out for us in PROMESA. And we look forward to continue working in collaboration with the House, the Senate, and the administration, regardless of where we are in their 4-year term.
The other question has to do with the fiscal plan itself. You're basically adopting the new interpretation from the Centers of Medicaid and Medicare. However, we've seen in your very same figures that those numbers could go from $400 million. That's what was basically allocated back under the previous administration. And now we're getting this huge jump in terms of Medicaid and the Vital medical coverage here in Puerto Rico. I'm wondering if we're not taking an incredible risk betting on that amount of money, and then we don't have a law. I mean, we just have an interpretation from a federal agency, and I'm wondering if that's not a huge risk for these new projections.
So thank you, Joanisabel. You're correct. This fiscal plan is based on the CMS interpretation, which the executive branch of the government is implementing. And we did it based on their own letter suggesting that this is what it is. And the board doesn't have any choices. We haven't in the past to reflect anything other than what is currently law, what is currently being implemented as law. To the extent that it could change in the future, and to the extent that that risk exists on the negative side, the language that the board included in the pension trust calculations allows for the pension trust to be revisited if, in fact, that Medicaid or other major federal funding into the budget changes dramatically. So that the pension trust, if that were to change, let's say 3 years from now, and you know it's a 10-year pension trust calculation, it might change year 4, 5, or 6 of the pension trust calculation, but it would not. It's one of the reasons why the pension trust is being funded now while these funds are available today. So there is some risk. I think most Puerto Ricans would argue that they will work. All parties will work in a very unified fashion to minimize that risk. But again, to the extent that there is a slight risk, a theoretical risk, that pension fund calculation would be amended and adapted.
My very last question, if I may. Although I understand your position regarding PROMESA, former Treasury Advisor Antonio Wise basically is saying that probably it's time to review PROMESA precisely to facilitate the end of the board. Do you think the current conditions for the board to complete its mandate should be revised or not? I'm clear that you're not asking for additional conditions, but the current ones that we have should be revised or not?
Johnny, I think you heard every board member on this call already give their personal opinion. I don't know what else. Everyone had a personal opinion. I think they shared it with you already.
Thank you. Next question, Kevin Riord.
Hi, thanks. Sort of a procedural question for Executive Director Jaresco. Will you submit a separate new revenue forecast to the government to guide the fiscal 2022 budget amendment process, or is that process more just a matter of moving existing money around to cover plan of adjustment and fiscal plan measures? And if you are going to submit a new revenue forecast, when will that be, and what may the forecast be?
Yes, I believe we are, and I believe it will be in the next days, as early next week. We want to move forward with amending the fiscal year 22 budget to enable the effective date on March 15th and the payment of all the payments required under the plan of adjustment, the payment of creditors of the Sistema 2000 accounts. Again, there are just hundreds and hundreds of payments to be made on the effective date. All that needs to be appropriated in the fiscal year 22 budget amendment. And that process begins sharply after we certify today.
Kevin, do you have any more questions? No? Any other question? ¿Alguna otra
No, I'm
pregunta?
good, thanks.
Okay, so I think that's it for today.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.